Well, this was a completely new form of biography for me because up till now I've always written in the shadow of Sigmund Freud, really, as most biographers do. That's to say, right from the very beginning, you lace into the story an understanding of the psychology of the subject. Now, in this case, where I was dealing with 12 American presidents, it was very important, I thought, to be able to see their political careers in the highest focus. And I thought it would detract from that focus, especially when I'm more or less comparing these 12 presidents. It would detract from that focus if I embedded the psychology of the individual too early. So I looked back at this model which the famous Roman historian and biographer Suetonius had developed in his great work 2,000 years ago, The 12 Caesars. And I saw that he had, after telling how each Caesar got to the emperor's palace in Rome, how he conducted himself as emperor, and only then, when that description was over, only then did Suetonius look at the private life, the love life of the great Caesars, you know, Julius Caesar, or even the tyrants, you know, Caligula, Tiberius, Nero. And strangely, it's a model that hasn't really ever been used in the succeeding 2,000 years since Suetonius. I thought I tried it on the very first one I tackled, which the first president I look at is FDR, but for the first model I looked at Harry Truman. And you know, here was an individual who was thrust into the presidency without really expecting to have to take over the extraordinary responsibilities of the empire in 1945, and particularly the question of whether to use the atom bomb. And I found that this approach, keeping it as clear as possible in terms of the career of the man before looking at his private life, worked wonderfully well, and my editor in London was pleased with it. So that is the model I began to use for the whole book. I don't think I found a problem in following that model once I'd established it. It was amazing how quickly it coagulated and seemed the right way to approach it. No, I was pleased with that. The problem was much more that, you know, these presidents, serially, one after the other, face such enormous challenges in the latter part of the 20th century and the first decade in the 21st century, that my problem was just how to stop the book becoming 1,000 pages instead of whatever, 500 or 600 pages. Well, I did think that one of the advantages of a transplanted Brit tackling the lives of the last 12 presidents, I did feel that one advantage was that I'd been born and had grown up at the heart of another empire in Great Britain. I'd seen an empire gradually dissipating and seen its decline and fall as an empire. And so I think that gave me a certain objectivity in looking at the American empire since FDR really established it. I think the other thing is that I did feel that Americans were not only reluctant to see it as an empire, their own empire, despite the fact that it has been the world's dominant nation ever since the Second World War. But Americans were incredibly critical of their presidents and tended not to see what an amazing job they were doing as Caesars while they were in office. I mean, often they would forgive them, so to speak, after they left office, rather like Richard Nixon. But during the period of office, Americans do tend to be hypercritical, which I think must make it very difficult for the president in the White House to be so constantly battered by his own folks when he's trying to project across the world, you know, self-confidence and a vision and an idealism to inspire the democracies of the world. Well, I wouldn't like this book to be thought of as American Idol. I wrote it because I think I have the highest respect for these men who each of them made their way to the White House, often from very humble backgrounds, and the enormous challenges that they faced once they were in the White House. I would like people to think that here is a reasonably established historian and biographer writing about them with understanding and compassion. On the other hand, I've lived in this country for many years. I was here during the whole period of 9/11 and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and I feel very, very strongly about some of the things that have been done by previous American presidents. And so there are some pretty strong judgments in this book. I revere FDR. I think the first four of presidents, FDR, or first four Caesars, shall we call them, once the United States became an empire, FDR, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower, and John F. Kennedy in his way, were great men and great emperors. The problem that faced Lyndon Johnson once he went into Vietnam meant that that quality of greatness, I think, left the imperial presidency. The quality of judgment shown by the president in office seemed to me to change with Lyndon Johnson. I mean, here was a man who had incredible skill in terms of marshalling the votes in Congress, and who had tremendous strength of character in strong-arming both Democrats and Republicans to introduce the legislation he wanted over civil rights, Medicare, and so forth. And in that sense, he was a great president. But I don't think he was a great Caesar. That's to say, if your job is to lead the American empire as the outstanding democratic leader in the world and provide leaderships to other countries, you have to show enormous skills, not only of diplomacy, but of judgment. And the first four presidents, FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy, did show those skills. I think the problem with Lyndon Johnson was that there was I think in many ways it was a psychological problem. There was a part of him that didn't want actually to tackle those issues. I mean, most people have forgotten that Lyndon Johnson actually issued or drafted a letter of resignation in 1964. Not in 1968, but already in 1964, before he was even properly elected. He'd simply inherited the mantle of the presidency. You know, there was a certain lack of confidence, I think confidence in being Caesar. You know, he'd grown up in Texas. He could certainly, you know, rustle cattle, so to speak, in his own domain. And in Washington, you know, he was a force of nature, people called him. But in terms of running the empire, I'm not sure he really had it, and he deferred then to his generals, Westmoreland and people, and also he was afraid of the Republicans. He was afraid of that drum that they were banging for interceding in foreign countries and whacking the hell out of the communists. The last of my 12 presidents is George W. Bush, and in my view, he was the least effective of the 12 Caesars since FDR. In my view, FDR stands at the top of the podium, and I think George Bush is very much at the bottom. I think the reasons for that are many, but I have looked at them in this final chapter, and I think they're pretty relevant to the 13th Caesar, who is currently in office, particularly as we approach the midterm elections. I think it all comes down to judgment. George W. Bush's problem was that he was actually a pretty popular governor of Texas, and he showed considerable bipartisanship. I think that is actually more in his nature, but he made a fatal mistake even before he became president. He chose the wrong man as vice president. Dick Cheney, he didn't really know. He represented an older man, more experience, and so here was this young governor, and he thought, well, that would play well with the public. And he asked Dick Cheney to be the vice president without realizing what sort of evil this man was capable of, and what a tough character he would be to deal with as his deputy. Now, the decisions that were then made after 9/11, first not only to seek out Osama bin Laden, but to occupy Afghanistan and begin nation building, and then fatefully to invade Iraq, seemed to me two of the worst decisions made over the last 100 years by an American president. And the problem is that the current president, the 13th Caesar, has inherited those problems. And it is remarkably difficult, as I've tried to show in this book, for a president to reverse the tide once it's come in. He inherits what his predecessor has done or hasn't done. And these 12 chapters show how often that takes place, where the incoming president has to deal with the crises and the problems, particularly in the Middle East, in terms of Israel and Palestine, that his predecessor has left him. My experience in looking at these 12 presidents is that almost invariably they lose the midterm elections, in the sense of Congress losing not necessarily its majority, but certainly losing significant numbers of seats. As we said earlier, the American public is extremely critical of its president. It has this love affair during the campaign, the electoral campaign. It has a brief honeymoon. That honeymoon has become shorter and shorter, and it becomes, the public becomes so enormously expectant in terms of what a president can achieve. Well, we know that thanks to the wonderful checks and balances of our Constitution, there is a limited amount that the president can achieve, certainly in terms of legislation. And I think it will take certainly the second 2 years of Obama's first term in office, and possibly a second term, before he can really establish an independence of judgment from the issues that his predecessor left him with in Afghanistan and Iraq. If I was to go back in time myself and visualize myself in the time of one of these American Caesars, to my own surprise, having researched and written the book, I think I would be most interested in the 1950s, during the period of General Eisenhower, or President Eisenhower. I was fascinated to review the history of McCarthyism, how a sort of Tea Party individual, I mean a rather wacky senator who had originally come from one party, who transferred his allegiance to another party, could have drummed up in the United States so much hysteria and used so many sheer lies, like lists of communists in the American government, course never naming any names, but saying he had a secret list. The way McCarthy operated with the FBI, and I thought, writing the book, the way Eisenhower, the patience, the tolerance showed by the president in keeping the country stable during that period with more and more anti-communist hysteria, and how finally McCarthy was dealt with. How Eisenhower, when McCarthy had been exposed during the hearings by the Chief Army Council on television, and how Eisenhower invited him, this army attorney, to the White House to sort of pat him on the back and congratulating him and say what a great job he'd done to bring sanity back to the American nation. I would have loved to have been there. American Caesars came out in Britain in June and is due to arrive in bookstores for September the 7th in the United States. Lives of the Presidents from Franklin D. Roosevelt to George W. Bush.